A black stone in a Paris museum still speaks for a king who died nearly 4,000 years ago. At the top, he stands before a god of justice. Below, line after line, he tells the world what order should look like. Empires bigger than his vanished into dust. Names louder than his faded. But Hammurabi is still here. And the reason is not just that he conquered Babylon's enemies. It is that he found a way to make power look eternal. That is the real mystery of Hammurabi, not how he won, but how he made a ruler's voice survive the ruler himself. Because before Babylon became a name that echoed across history, it was only one city among many, boxed in by stronger rivals and older traditions. It sat in the river world of Mesopotamia, where canals were as important as armies, and where grain, trade, and water could decide who ruled. To the south stood richer cities. To the east and north were dangerous kingdoms. Babylon was not born at the center of the map. When Hammurabi came to the throne, he did not inherit a world empire. He inherited a problem. And he solved that problem in a way that changed human government forever, not by being the first man with laws, but by turning law into a monument. That matters because earlier rulers had already issued laws. Mesopotamia knew contracts, judges, customs, penalties, and temple authority long before Hammurabi. But Hammurabi understood something sharper. A kingdom is stronger when justice does not feel hidden in a palace room. It has to feel visible. It has to feel sacred. It has to feel bigger than the king's mood on any single day. That idea did not come to him in peace. It came in a landscape where every city had walls, every harvest could fail, and every ally could become an enemy. Hammurabi was the sixth ruler of Babylon's Amorite dynasty. He followed a father whose position had been weakened by stronger neighbors, especially the kingdom of Larsa. So his opening move was not reckless conquest, it was survival. He strengthened Babylon from the inside first. Walls rose, temples were restored, public works expanded, the city began to look less like prey and more like a capital. He also did something clever than simple construction. He made himself useful to ordinary people. More than once during his reign, debts were canceled. That was not charity in the modern sense. It was politics, relief, and social control all at once. A farmer crushed by debt cannot love his king. A farmer rescued from debt might. So while other rulers measured strength only in chariots and spears, Hammurabi measured it in loyalty, stability, and grain. He built canals, and in Mesopotamia, canals were lifelines. Water meant crops, taxes, movement, and survival. He improved infrastructure that made Babylon wealthier and harder to break. A strong city does not begin with banners. It begins with supply. He built and restored temples because gods mattered, not just spiritually but politically. In the ancient world, the ruler was expected to care for divine order. Rebuilding a temple was never just a construction project. It was a statement that heaven still favored the throne. Hammurabi made sure Babylon looked prosperous, pious, and protected. That was the foundation beneath every campaign that followed. And then he waited. That patience is part of what makes him so fascinating. He did not burst onto the map like a wildfire. He watched rival kingdoms tire themselves out. He learned the balance of forces. He tested where the seams were weakest. Mesopotamia in his day was a chessboard of city-states, dynasties, and temporary alliances. No one trusted anyone for long. A king could call another king brother in one season and march on his walls in the next. Diplomacy and betrayal were separated by almost nothing. Hammurabi learned to work that world better than almost anyone. He could negotiate, flatter, threaten, and strike with equal calm. For years he expanded carefully. He pushed against rivals when the timing helped him and held back when the field was not ready. He moved against cities such as Uruk and Essene, undermining the power of his southern competitors and tightening Babylon's reach. Still, he was not yet master of Mesopotamia. The biggest challenge remained. That challenge was Larsa, ruled by Rimsin, a powerful rival whose control in the south cast a long shadow over Babylon's ambitions. Hammurabi could not rush that fight. He had to weaken the world around it first. So he hardened his own frontiers. He kept building. He kept managing. He kept positioning Babylon as the kingdom that would survive when others overextended themselves. And then the balance changed. Coalitions formed against him. Enemies circled. Pressure came from powerful states like Eshnunna and from the wider struggle that pulled in Assyria and Elam. This was the moment a lesser king might have been crushed between larger players. Hammurabi did the opposite. He adapted faster than they did. He broke alliances, shifted priorities, and fought with a kind of cold flexibility that made him dangerous. Ancient accounts suggest he may even have used water as a weapon, manipulating canals and river flow against rivals in a land that lived by irrigation. That kind of warfare tells you everything about Mesopotamia. Victory was not always a cavalry charge across a field. Sometimes victory meant thirst. Sometimes it meant flood. Sometimes it meant turning the land itself into an accomplice. When Hammurabi finally struck Larsa decisively, he was not just defeating a king. He was removing the great obstacle to Babylonian dominance in the south. That victory changed the map. Now Babylon was no longer one ambitious city among others. It was becoming the power around which others had to orbit. But Hammurabi was not finished. He kept moving. He turned west toward Mari, the kingdom that had once been useful as an ally and gateway. Its ruler, Zimri Lom, had reason to think diplomacy still mattered. Hammurabi eventually showed how little that protection meant when interests changed. Mari fell too. That conquest mattered for more than pride. Mari sat on vital trade routes and political crossroads linking different worlds together. By taking it, Hammurabi did not just enlarge his territory. He tightened his grip on communication, commerce, and strategic movement. East, west, north, south, one by one, the old centers were bent toward Babylon. For the first time in generations, much of Mesopotamia stood under a single ruler again. Not since the great empire builders of earlier ages had the region been drawn together like this. That is the part people remember as the triumphant rise, and it was real. Hammurabi unified a fractured landscape. He pushed Babylon from the edge of relevance to the center of power. He did it with armies, yes, but also with administration. His surviving letters show a king deeply involved in details. He was not a distant symbol floating above the state. He cared about canals, officials, supplies, judges, temples, and logistics. He wanted the machine to move because he was moving it. That hands-on rule made Babylon effective. It also planted the seed of his greatest weakness. Because a kingdom that depends too much on one mind becomes brilliant and fragile at the same time. At the height of his power, Hammurabi did something even more lasting than conquest. He ordered his legal judgments gathered and inscribed on stone. This is the move that made him immortal. Not because no one had made laws before him. They had. Not because the loan of core internet celebrities wine. Modern standards, they were not. The laws treated people differently according to status. Punishments could change depending on whether the victim or offender was elite, common, or enslaved. This was not democracy in ancient costume. It was a deeply hierarchical society speaking in a clear voice. And still, it was revolutionary. Because Hammurabi took royal justice and made it visible, organized, and memorable on a monumental scale. The famous collection contains 282 judgments. They cover property, labor, trade, debt, marriage, divorce, inheritance, injury, theft, and more. You can feel the whole society moving inside those lines. Builders, boatmen, merchants, families, farmers, doctors, debtors, judges. It is less like reading abstract philosophy and more like walking through the crowded streets of old Babylon. Again and again, the laws move in a pattern. If this happens, then this follows. That structure matters. It gives law a rhythm. It sounds ordered, predictable, repeatable. In a world where power could feel personal and sudden, that rhythm sent a message. Justice has a form. Even the monument itself was part of the message. At the top, Hammurabi stands before Shamash, the sun god associated with justice. He is not shown inventing law out of thin air. He is shown receiving authority within a divine order. That image is political genius. It says the king does not rule by raw appetite alone. He rules because cosmic order flows through him. In the long prologue and epilogue surrounding the laws, Hammurabi presents himself as a shepherd, protector, and bringer of justice to the weak. Now, that language was propaganda. Of course it was. But propaganda only works when it touches something people need to believe. And people needed to believe that power could restrain violence, debt, and chaos. That was the real achievement. Hammurabi made kingship sound like guardianship. He made obedience feel connected to order, not just fear. He made law part of the architecture of empire. And that is why the stone matters more than the sword. Conquest wins the map. Law tells people how to live on it. At Babylon's peak, this vision must have felt immense. The city prospered. Trade moved. Temples stood restored. Waterworks fed the fields. Babylon looked like the place where the world had settled into shape. The center of gravity in Mesopotamia shifted north under his rule. That was one of the most lasting geopolitical changes of his age. For people living inside the kingdom, Hammurabi could appear to be more than a conqueror. He could appear to be the man who made disorder stop. That image was powerful enough to outlive him, but it also hid a problem. The more order depended on Hammurabi personally, the less secure that order became without him. And this is where the story turns. Before we go further, I want to pause on one question. Was Hammurabi really a champion of justice, or was he one of history's greatest masters of political image-making? Maybe he was both. Maybe that is exactly why he still fascinates people. Let me know in the comments where you land, because the answer changes how you see everything that came next. At first, the flaw was invisible. Success hides weakness better than failure ever can. When the cities are subdued and the grain is flowing, no one wants to ask whether the system is too dependent on one man. But Hammurabi's empire was held together by relentless personal attention. He was the center of decisions, administration, legitimacy, and momentum. That worked while he was strong. It was much harder to sustain when age began to press in. He had spent years defeating rivals and, in the process, removing buffer states that once stood between Babylon and outside threats. That made him safer in the short term. In the long term, it exposed the empire. A ruler driven by control often makes the same bargain. To eliminate uncertainty, he eliminates distance. And then one day he discovers there is nothing left between his kingdom and the next storm. Hammurabi kept building even in his later years. Fortifications rose, defensive concerns sharpened. The mood of rule changed. That shift tells its own story. The great organizer could feel the edges fraying. His achievements were still enormous, but achievement does not cancel vulnerability. By the end of his life, the burden of rule was already passing toward his son Samsuiluna. The old king was no longer carrying it alone. That is one of the least cinematic details in the story and one of the most human. The man who had managed a vast state down to its working parts was aging inside the system he built. No final battlefield scene survives for him. No single dramatic duel closes his reign. What closes it is something colder, the quiet realization that a kingdom built on one ruler's personal grip cannot stay as steady when that grip loosens. Hammurabi died around 1750 BCE. His name survived. His empire did not hold together with the same strength. That is the irony at the center of his life. The king who carved order into stone could not carve permanence into politics. After his death, the military structure he had forged began to deteriorate quickly. The territories were harder to control than to conquer. Rebellions and pressures rose. Regional strains returned. The map started remembering its old habits. This is not because Hammurabi was a failure. Far from it. It is because empire is easier to assemble than to stabilize, especially when institutions are still growing around the force of one personality. His laws projected continuity. His administration often depended on immediacy. His monument said, "This order will stand." History replied, "Only if others can carry it without you." That is the fatal flaw of over-control. It creates brilliance without enough inheritance. And yet, the deepest twist was still ahead. Centuries after Hammurabi's death, the great stone bearing his laws was taken from Babylon as spoil of war by an Elamite ruler and carried away to Susa. Think about the cruelty of that image. A monument meant to anchor Babylonian kingship was dragged out of Babylon by a foreign conqueror. The stone of justice became a trophy of victory. The symbol of order became evidence of defeat. If you were writing this as fiction, it might feel too perfect. But history often prefers irony over clean endings. The empire shrank, dynasties shifted, new powers rose, old cities broke. Babylon itself would know glory again under later rulers, but Hammurabi's own political world was gone. The man who had bent Mesopotamia under one rule could not keep time from doing what enemies could not. Still, here's the part that changed law forever. The empire died. The monument lived. That survival matters because memory is its own kind of conquest. A king can win battles and vanish. Hammurabi won something rarer. He remained legible. When later ages looked back, they did not just see a conqueror. They saw a ruler who had attached justice to written authority in a public way. That does not mean modern law descends neatly from his stone like a straight bloodline. History is never that simple. But it does mean Hammurabi became one of the great symbols of a civilization trying to bind power to declared rules. And symbols shape history almost as much as armies do. His code showed that law could be collected, displayed, and linked to the legitimacy of the state itself. It showed that a ruler could present himself not merely as strongest, but as lawful. That idea would echo far beyond Babylon. Not because letter legal systems copied every judgment, most did not, but because the image endured, a government justifying itself through written order. That is one reason Hammurabi still appears in conversations about law, justice, punishment, and the origins of state power. Even the harshest parts of the collection survive in public memory. An eye for an eye still flashes through modern speech, strict from its ancient setting but never fully forgotten. And that phrase is often misunderstood. To modern ears, it sounds like pure vengeance. In context, it also carried the idea of proportion, that punishment should answer injury instead of spiraling into unlimited retaliation. Again, not equality, not mercy in the modern sense, but a limit. A state saying revenge belongs inside a rule. That is a massive change in human thinking. Because once rules are written, power has to explain itself differently. It cannot rely only on force, it has to claim principle. And once law is visible, even if imperfectly, people can measure rulers against what rulers say. That may be Hammurabi's deepest legacy of all. He did not create justice from nothing. He gave authority a script. He turned the king into an actor inside a moral performance that the public could witness. That performance was not always fair. It was not always humane. It was certainly not modern. But it was durable. The black stone found at Susa in the early 20th century, then displayed in the Louvre, reminds us of something powerful and unsettling. Human beings have always wanted justice to feel solid. Solid enough to stand in front of. Solid enough to outlast fear. Hammurabi understood that desire. He carved it. And that is why a ruler from ancient Babylon still feels strangely present. Not because he was the most merciful king, not because he was the first to write laws, but because he grasped that law is one of civilization's greatest illusions and greatest necessities at the same time. It is an illusion because every law still needs power behind it. It is a necessity because power without declared limits becomes unbearable. Hammurabi stood right at that crossroads. That is why his story still matters. He showed how a conqueror becomes more than a conqueror. He becomes the voice that tells a civilization what order is supposed to mean. Even if the civilization changes, even if the empire falls, even if the stone travels farther than the king ever dreamed. So when people remember Hammurabi, they should remember the warrior, yes. They should remember the patient strategist, the city builder, the diplomat, the opportunist, the ruler who made Babylon the center of a wider world. But above all, they should remember the deeper transformation. He made law visible enough to become part of history's memory. And in doing that, he did something armies almost never do. He outlived victory. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like so I know you want more rulers whose decisions still shake the world around us. Subscribe if you want the next rise, the next empire, and the next moment when one human being bends history in a new direction. And tell me in the comments which ruler you want next, because there is no shortage of conquerors, lawgivers, and kings waiting in the dark. Some built with fear, some built with faith, some built with genius so sharp it cut their own future. Hammurabi built with stone, law, and control. The next story may belong to someone who tried to build with pure fire. And if Hammurabi taught the world how power could be written down, the next ruler might show what happens when power decides writing is not enough.